Evening had settled over the village of Kilosa, a place where life was as predictable as the rising sun. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, women hurriedly packed away their market goods, and the elders gathered under the great Iroko tree to exchange stories from long ago. But in one home, just beyond the well-trodden paths and the glow of flickering oil lamps, something unspoken was building, something so fragile that even the smallest crack could shatter it entirely. Inside that house, Nkechi sat quietly in the dim light of her living room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air around her was thick, not with the comforting warmth of her family, but with a silence so loud it felt suffocating. She had been holding something inside for weeks now, months even, a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Tonight it was too much. It wasn't the kind of weight you share with neighbours or gossip about at the market. It was the kind of weight that breaks people, slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold together. And then, it happened. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Jide, this isn't right." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned away, gripping the edge of the table for support. Jide froze, his face pale with regret. But as Nkechi struggled to steady herself, her back turned to him, something shifted. Instead of stepping away, Jide stood and moved closer. Welcome to Mama Africa's Stories, where captivating African stories are brought to life. Today's story is one of love, betrayal, and the consequences of choices made in a moment of weakness. Stay with us to uncover how a family was torn apart and what it took to rebuild their trust. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that touch the heart and soul. For over 25 years, Nkechi and Obinna had been the beating heart of their home. Their marriage was not just a union, it was a partnership, a bond built on trust, understanding, and a shared vision for the future. To their neighbours, they seemed unbreakable, a shining example of what love could be. Even after decades together, there was a warmth between them that others envied. Their mornings were filled with quiet moments. As the first light of the sun pierced through the curtains, Obinna would often wake up before Nkechi, stepping outside to check on their small farm. By the time Nkechi stirred, she would find him back in the house, humming an old song as he prepared a pot of hot water for her morning tea. Their days were simple yet fulfilling. Nkechi managed the household with a steady hand, her presence bringing a sense of calm to everyone around her. She would spend her mornings pounding yam or grinding pepper at the stone mortar, her laughter often carrying through the air as Obinna teased her about one thing or another. Obinna, on the other hand, was the provider. His strong hands tilled the soil, built the fences, and kept their home running. But his heart was soft, especially when it came to Nkechi. He had a way of turning the smallest tasks into shared moments, whether it was helping her with the cooking or surprising her with wildflowers he picked from the edge of their farm. The joy of their lives, however, was their only son, Kelechi. From the moment he was born, he had been their pride and purpose. Obinna often said that raising Kelechi had been his life's greatest achievement, while Nkechi would smile and quietly agree. Kelechi had grown into a young man of character and ambition, someone who carried the values his parents had instilled in him. From an early age, Kelechi had shown a hunger for knowledge. While other children spent their afternoons playing in the fields, Kelechi could often be found with a book in hand, asking his mother and father endless questions about the world beyond the village. "One day," he would say, "I'll make you both proud." And that he did. When Kelechi graduated from university, it was more than just an achievement for him. It was a victory for the entire family. He had taken what little they had given him and turned it into something remarkable. On the day he returned home with his certificate, Nkechi had cried tears of joy while Obinna had held his son close, whispering words of pride that only Kelechi could hear. "You've done well," Obinna had said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You've done more than we ever dreamed." For the rest of the evening, the family celebrated, their small home filled with laughter and music. For years, their home had been a place of peace and joy, a place where trust and love were constants, and where no challenge seemed too great. But what they didn't know was that life was about to test them in ways they never imagined. Because behind even the strongest walls, cracks can begin to form. And in the quiet moments that followed their happiest days, the first faint echoes of change were beginning to stir. Life in the Obinna household was filled with pride and joy after Kelechi's graduation. For months, the family had basked in the glow of his accomplishments. Villagers spoke of him with admiration, and his parents, Nkechi and Obinna, felt their hard work and sacrifices had been worth it. But life, as it often does, had another turn waiting for them. One afternoon, Kelechi walked into their home with news that would bring both celebration and quiet heartache. "Mama, Papa, I have something to tell you," Kelechi began, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and nerves. Obinna leaned forward, his brows raised, while Nkechi stepped closer, wiping her hands and staring at her son with expectant eyes. Kelechi took a deep breath, then held up the letter in his hand. "I've been offered a scholarship to study abroad," he exclaimed. The room fell silent for a moment, as if time itself had paused to let the words settle. Then, like the sudden strike of a drum, Nkechi let out a joyful cry, throwing her arms in the air and breaking into an impromptu dance. Obinna stood, his face lighting up with pride, and grabbed his son in a firm embrace. The scholarship was a dream come true, not just for Kelechi, but for the entire family. It was a prestigious program, offering the chance to study in a country far from the dusty roads of their village. It was an opportunity that could change Kelechi's life forever, giving him the tools to succeed in ways his parents had only dreamed of. "This is it, my son," Obinna said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This is your chance to shine, to show the world what you're made of." Nkechi nodded in agreement, her hands clasped tightly together. "You'll go and make us proud," she added, her voice bright but trembling slightly at the edges. For the rest of the evening, the family celebrated. Nkechi prepared Kelechi's favourite meal, bitter leaf soup with pounded yam, and neighbours stopped by to join in the excitement. The house that had grown quiet after Kelechi's graduation was alive once again, filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of cups raised in toasts. But even as Nkechi danced and laughed, there was a shadow that lingered in her heart. She knew this was a blessing, a once-in-a-lifetime chance for her son, but she also knew what it would mean for her home. For the first time since his birth, Kelechi would be far away. The thought of waking up to an empty house, of not hearing his laughter or watching him work in the yard, filled her with a quiet ache. That night, after the celebrations had ended and the house had gone quiet, Nkechi sat alone by the window. The faint glow of the moon bathed the room in a soft light as she looked out toward the horizon. She thought of all the moments she and Kelechi had shared, his first steps, his first words, the way he had always looked to her for guidance. She didn't regret encouraging him to dream big, but now, as the reality of his departure sank in, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence that would soon fill their home. "He'll be fine," Obinna said softly, breaking the silence. Nkechi turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but the house won't be the same." Obinna nodded, his hand tightening around hers. "The house may be quieter, but our hearts will be full. And when he returns, he'll bring back stories and wisdom that we can only dream of." Nkechi smiled faintly, holding on to her husband's words. One afternoon, as the sun hung lazily in the sky, Obinna's old friend, Jide, arrived at the house. Jide was a familiar face, someone who had been close to the family for years. Known for his easy smile and cheerful stories, Jide's visits were a welcome distraction in the quiet days that had followed Kelechi's departure. With his signature basket of fresh fruits and his booming voice, Jide brought a spark of life back into the house. For Nkechi, his presence was a relief, breaking the monotony of her days and momentarily lifting the weight of her loneliness. Jide had a way of weaving stories that made even the smallest events sound extraordinary. As he spoke about his travels, the bustling markets he had visited, and the colourful characters he had met, Nkechi found herself leaning forward, caught up in his tales. For a moment, the quiet of the house seemed to fade away. "You've done well raising Kelechi," Jide said at one point, his tone softening. "He's a fine young man, and it's clear he carries your strength." Nkechi's smile grew wider at the mention of her son, her pride momentarily washing away her sadness. As the afternoon turned to evening, Jide suggested they move outside to enjoy the cool breeze. Nkechi carried a mat to the shaded courtyard, and the two sat under the large mango tree. The warm glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground as they continued their conversation. Jide spoke of old times, of the days when he and Obinna had been young men, full of ambition and plans for the future. Nkechi listened, occasionally chiming in with her own memories, her laughter blending with the chirping of evening crickets. For Nkechi, Jide's visit was a balm for her weary soul. His stories reminded her of the lively days before Kelechi had left, and his easy laughter made the silence of her home feel a little less oppressive. Though the day had started like so many others, quiet and heavy, it ended with warmth and a renewed sense of connection. That evening, as Nkechi prepared dinner, the house felt less lonely. The sound of Jide's laughter and the stories he had shared echoed in her mind, bringing a rare sense of lightness to her heart. For the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. The rain fell steadily that evening, drumming against the tin roof and drowning out the usual sounds of the village. Inside Nkechi's home, the air was thick with the warmth of the fire and the quiet tension between two people who knew they were nearing a line they shouldn't cross. When Jide knocked on the door, soaked from the downpour, Nkechi hesitated for only a moment before letting him in. His smile was warm and his voice, as always, carried a comforting familiarity. But that evening, something was different. They sat together by the fire, the sound of the storm wrapping around them like a cocoon. Their conversation started lightly, with Jide sharing stories of his day and Nkechi listening quietly, grateful for the distraction. But as the rain continued to fall, the tone of their conversation shifted. The words came slower, the silences grew longer, and the warmth in Jide's voice took on a weight that hadn't been there before. "You've been so strong, Nkechi," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I see how much you've carried, how much you've sacrificed. You deserve more than this loneliness." When Jide reached out and placed his hand over hers, Nkechi didn't pull away immediately. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She knew this wasn't right. She knew this wasn't the kind of connection she wanted. But in that moment, the weight of her loneliness overpowered her better judgment. Slowly, Jide leaned in. His movements were deliberate and his intentions were unmistakable. When their lips met, Nkechi froze. The kiss was hesitant at first, a fleeting touch that quickly grew deeper. For a moment, she allowed herself to give in, her vulnerability overwhelming her resistance. But as the kiss deepened, a wave of clarity crashed over Nkechi. She pulled away abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she stood. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Jide, this isn't right." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned away, gripping the edge of the table for support. Jide froze, his face pale with regret. But as Nkechi struggled to steady herself, her back turned to him. Something shifted. Instead of stepping away, Jide stood and moved closer. "Nkechi, please," Jide said, his voice soft but insistent. You don't have to be alone tonight. She turned to face him, her tears streaking her cheeks. I said no, Jide. This isn't what I want, she replied, her voice breaking. But Jide couldn't stop. His hand brushed her arm, then her waist, and before Nkechi could move away, he pulled her closer. Jide, stop, she said, her voice rising in desperation as she tried to push him away. But he held on, his actions no longer guided by reason. Caught in his own emotions, he refused to let go, and despite her resistance, he didn't stop. Nkechi's protests faded into silence as the storm outside raged on. When it was over, the silence in the room was deafening. Nkechi sat on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, tears streaming down her face. Jide stood by the door, his back turned to her, his shoulders slumped in regret. I'm sorry, Jide said finally, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. But Nkechi didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was too full, of guilt, of anger, of confusion. She stared at the fire, the embers glowing faintly as the weight of what had just happened settled heavily over her. Without another word, Jide opened the door and stepped into the storm. Nkechi didn't watch him leave. She couldn't bring herself to move. As the rain continued to pour, the sound of his footsteps faded into the night, leaving her alone in the silence. That night, Nkechi sat by the fire until it died out, the darkness of the room swallowing her whole. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest, each passing moment reminding her that life as she knew it would never be the same. The morning after the storm, the skies cleared, but the weight of what had happened the night before hung heavily over Nkechi. She had barely slept, her thoughts racing with guilt and regret. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the memory of what she could not undo. The once familiar walls now felt like they were closing in on her. Obinna noticed the change immediately. At first, he thought she was simply tired from the previous night's storm. But as the hours passed, her distant behaviour became harder to ignore. Nkechi, are you all right? Obinna asked gently that afternoon as they sat in the kitchen. Nkechi looked up, startled by his voice, and forced a smile. I'm fine, she replied quickly, turning her face away. But the cracks in her facade were becoming too visible. Obinna, ever patient, didn't push her, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, and the quiet concern in his voice only added to the guilt that threatened to consume her. That evening, as the sun began to set, the phone rang. It was Kelechi. Nkechi hesitated before answering, her heart pounding in her chest. She forced a smile into her voice as she greeted her son, but the moment she heard his familiar laugh, the facade crumbled. Mama, are you all right? Kelechi asked, his tone shifting to concern. Nkechi tried to respond, but her voice cracked, and before she could stop herself, the tears came. She clutched the phone tightly, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. Mama, what's wrong? Kelechi asked urgently, his voice filled with worry. Nkechi struggled to respond, her words coming out in broken fragments. I'm fine, she finally said, though her trembling voice betrayed her. I'm just tired. Kelechi paused, his concern evident. Are you sure? He pressed. Nkechi nodded, though he couldn't see her. After the call ended, Nkechi sat motionless, the phone still clutched in her hand. She had managed to keep her secret from Kelechi, but the weight of her guilt only grew heavier. She knew she couldn't hide it forever. As the house grew darker, Nkechi realized she was standing on the edge of a precipice. The truth she knew would eventually have to come out. But what she didn't know was how much it would cost her, or how deeply it would shake the foundation of the life she had built. For days, Obinna watched Nkechi closely. He could sense the distance in her behaviour, the sadness that lingered in her every movement. He didn't know the reason, but he knew it wasn't something small. Her once bright laughter had faded into silence, and the warmth that had always filled their home now felt strained. Obinna decided it was time to confront her. Nkechi, Obina began, his voice steady but firm. "I need to know what's going on. You've been distant for weeks now, and I can't ignore it anymore. What's troubling you?" Nkechi froze, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of her wrapper. For a moment she said nothing, her mind racing with thoughts of denial, of avoidance. But deep down, she knew the truth would eventually come out. She owed it to him, and to herself, to speak. "Obina," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been hiding." Her words came slowly, haltingly, as if each syllable carried the weight of the world. And then she told him everything. About the storm, about Jide, and about the moment of weakness that had changed everything. Obina's face remained unreadable as she spoke, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. When she finished, there was silence, long and unbearable. Nkechi braced herself for his anger, his disappointment, but when he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Nkechi," Obina began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You hurt me deeply. I won't lie about that. But I know you, and I know your heart. I know how lonely you've been since Kelechi left. And while I can't pretend this didn't happen, I can choose to forgive you." Nkechi's eyes filled with fresh tears, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. Obina shook his head. "We've built too much together to let this break us. But trust takes time to rebuild, Nkechi, and we'll rebuild it together." Months later, Kelechi returned home for a visit. The moment he stepped through the door, the house came alive again with laughter and joy. Nkechi hugged her son tightly, tears streaming down her face as she held him close. Obina clapped Kelechi on the back, his pride evident as he welcomed him home. In the end, the mistakes they had made didn't define them. What mattered was how they chose to move forward, together. Nkechi and Obina learned that forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was possible. And with their son back home, the family found their way back to each other, stronger than before. Nkechi's story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments there is a path forward. It may not be easy, and it may require courage, honesty, and forgiveness. But healing is always possible. Her journey teaches us that mistakes don't have to define us. It's how we choose to respond to them that matters most. What would you have done in her place? How would you handle the weight of such a decision? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more heartfelt African tales that inspire, teach, and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories from the heart of Africa. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and move you.